Robert, the developments in Ahmaud Arbery, you've seen them?
Yeah, so I watched part of the hearing. The Law and Crime Network, which I occasionally commentate and write for, it's founded by Floyd Abrams' son, Dan Abrams? Yeah, Dan Abrams, who does ABC News legal commentary. I've debated it with him. Rachel Stockman runs the site. She's really nice, sweetheart. She's the daughter of David Stockman, famous OMB budget guy who has some independent political issues and had to deal with his own insane criminal prosecution many years ago. They did a live video because of the state court proceeding, unlike a federal court proceeding. They actually had live video up. So I watched part of the proceedings. I think it's about 7.5, 8 hours, the preliminary hearing they conducted there. It was an interesting political choice to go that route for the prosecution because in a lot of states, unlike the federal system, which requires generally grand jury by indictment by grand jury under the Fifth Amendment, in the states you can you can skip the grand jury by doing a criminal complaint with a sworn out affidavit attached to it by a police officer, and then the court conducts the probable cause hearing instead of the grand jury. They call it a preliminary hearing. They often waive those, but smart lawyers will use them to develop intel and information. The prosecutor, I think, chose to go that path, maybe because they don't trust the local grand jury. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that that they think that they could get some PR out of the preliminary hearing, and they did. I would say from a factual perspective, the government's case was stronger after the preliminary hearing on Arbery because they have apparently racist statements attributed to both the son and the person who was following. Also, they explained better what was not explained initially as to why this third guy was charged. He apparently trapped Arbery and was following Arbery and wouldn't allow Arbery to even escape in different directions. So that explains why he was charged. I still think there's issues with the charge, but it makes a lot more sense than just he happened to be following him and videotaped it. The third, and there was a history of him making racist comments as well, at least according to the preliminary hearing. And then the third aspect is Arbery's behavior made a lot more sense. That he really was being tracked by two different vehicles, tried to escape in multiple different directions, and they wouldn't allow him by threatening the threat of violence with the car. So so that makes his behavior, I still think, not a great decision, obviously, to rush a guy with a shotgun, but it makes more sense. In other words, his belief he was trapped was a legitimate belief. Now there'll be the constant question: did he believe he was trapped because he was caught committing a crime in the past, or did he believe he was trapped because these guys are crazies? So that's a question we can't fully answer because he's not around. So we can just infer from the evidence. So I think the government's case got stronger. It was interesting to me what did not come out too, though, and that was strongest for the father. I assume that if they had any evidence if they had any new forensic evidence different than what the original prosecutor who passed on the case had, I figured they would present it. They did not present anything along those lines in terms of the gun, the time, how the gun went off, where it went off. It explains why they're bringing felony murder charges, just like they are, interestingly enough, in George Floyd's case. And then it also, but the other aspect was there was no problematic history with the father. So they apparently, and this should make go ahead.
Actually, let me stop you there. No problematic history or no history?
They didn't discuss anything about any allegations that he had used racist language, racist references, had made any racially biased statements. They've done a pretty expansive investigation. It's interesting where these thought crimes, where these thought crimes are going, because they apparently searched all of their cell phones, all of their social media, all of their emails. Typically, a search warrant would be limited to something relevant to the crime. But I presume their theory was they were going to say that their motivation could not have been a reasonable suspicion of a felony, because instead they were motivated by racial hatred or racial bias. And that, I guess, opened the door for them to probably look at almost every single communication they've ever had, because otherwise that's a mighty broad search warrant that they executed. The only other thing I would say on the defense side of the aisle is that the cop, I only watched part of his cross-examination, but he was unduly defensive about things he didn't have to be defensive about. To give an example, they were just asking how long he was at the judge's when he gave the judge oral testimony beyond his written affidavit to swear out the initial warrants. And he played a lot of games with how long he was there. And it took forever for them to just get him to admit, well, was it longer than 2 or 3 minutes? Okay, maybe. Well, was it more than an hour, hour and a half? Well, maybe it was less than an hour. It's like, what? He didn't know how long he was there. He didn't have a range. I'm not buying. The guy's a 19-year officer. So if he would be defensive about that.
If I stop you there for 1 second, sorry. The 19-year officer is the guy recording, right?
No. So this is the cop investigating the McMichaels.
Okay.
So this is the prosecutor's main witness at the preliminary hearing. And so he swore out a warrant. He's the one who swore out the warrant to get the arrest and was part of the process of skipping the grand jury to go to this preliminary hearing and then go to trial if the judge says that probable cause has been met at the preliminary hearing. He was the only government witness to my knowledge. He was on the stand a long time. And sometimes a lot of cops will be defensive. What I'll say in his defense is that he did not, he's not a smooth liar. So he's not a trained liar. He's not a guy who lies a lot. He's not Mark Furman from the OJ case. You can look that up as part of the research for that discussion.
I remember who he is.
That's a man who could lie smooth. This guy's not that at all. But on the flip side, the fact that he was so defensive about something so basic. Now, it gets a high-profile case, so that may explain why. But it told me watching him, I was like, there's going to be more government misconduct in this case. There's something they're sitting on that they pushed the envelope on. Maybe they got a search warrant. Maybe they searched some stuff before they had a warrant. Maybe they searched more stuff than they were supposed to. Maybe they so that's going to be there is going to be a government misconduct angle to this case, will be my early prediction. But there's no question the case again on the Arbery side of the aisle got stronger because they have racist statements being made or accused of both the son and the third person being made against them, who are the strongest instigators, because the father was just in the passenger seat and then in the back of the truck cab. He never pulled his gun. He never shot his gun. Sorry. Sorry. I got to drink some.
And in fact, and now when you do that, I actually one thing before that, I'm confused on the identity or the relationship of the guy recording, the third person. Now it turns out that he was in a vehicle that was also chasing Arbery. And then during the additional evidence, it came out that someone struck Arbery with the vehicle and it caused damage to the right-hand side of the vehicle. Was that the McMichaels car or was that the video recording guy's car? Video recording guy.
Okay. So what happens, the video recording guy, and the other thing is, it's sort of his defense, but I found it a peculiar defense, but his argument is that he just followed what the father did. And so he knew who the father was. He knew that the father was someone who was sort of the community watch guy because he had the lifetime in law enforcement. Secondly, he said that he did think Arbery looked like the guy he had seen. Apparently, that video footage from inside the house, the house under construction, that showed someone that appears to be Arbery on 3 prior occasions. Apparently, that had been shared throughout the neighborhood in their home, whatever their association network, home neighborhood association was. So he saw that. He thought it looked like him. Then he saw the father and the son jump in the truck, and he thought, oh, they have him. So he followed him. But he didn't just follow him. He helped trap Arbery. When Arbery tried to go through some woods, he did something with the car that led to Arbery having contact with his car. And so he did more than just film it at the end. And so it explains why they went at him. Now, that guy was also dumb enough to yip to the police. So he obviously didn't think he did anything wrong. What's interesting is this whole case, my guess is, looking at it now, neither that guy nor the son will take the stand, is my early prediction. They'll hinge the whole case on the father. Because if they don't have any allegations of racism against the father, and both of them were, even from the government's narrative, it sounds like everybody was following the father as to why they thought they had reasonable suspicion. And the father's the one with the life experience, and the father is the one with the prior knowledge of Arbery. And he probably will come across the best. I think the son would have a hard time taking the stand given the scope of racially hateful things he apparently, this is just by the evidence alleged so far, but said a lot of racially hateful and violent things. There's going to be, now the interesting thing is here, whether that comes into evidence, probably an open question. It's at some degree, it's secondhand hearsay, not sure how they'll introduce it. But it really comes down, and there'll be probably a prejudice versus probative value question about it. But I assume the government's theory is that you can disbelieve their claim of reasonable suspicion because of their racially biased motivation. Which the interesting thing to me there is, at least in theory, a racist could also have reasonable suspicion of a crime. But down deep, we're not really going to tend to believe them because we so dislike morally their racism. And we already dislike the consequences of what took place here. So I think they're going to have the son. I think the son and the third guy are going to have a hard time with a jury, unless a jury can really distinguish those two factors, which I think are hard. Now, but if they don't have anything else against the father, it's almost like they're blaming the father for just being in the truck. And the father, so I think the father probably testifies. The father has the strongest defense. I would say right now, better than 50-50, the father gets acquitted. Less than that for both the son and the third man. I think that it's because of their history of racial bias in text and comments, unless that does not come into evidence or some of that presentation isn't quite what they made it out to be at the preliminary hearing. But I mean, the kind of statements he made were pretty extraordinary statements, if true. I mean, they expressed extreme violence, violent thoughts towards black men.
What and I don't want to lose my track of thought, but who said what when Arbery was on the ground and after he had been hit by the car? It was the third cameraman guy?
No, that's purportedly the son. The son said, used the N-word and then said something about, good he got him or good he was dead. Now, I think that statement is the least likely to come into evidence because that sounded like secondhand hearsay. And it was also, just by watching the video, my thought process was that couldn't have been a contemporaneous statement because they weren't in earshot of him at the time. So I suspect that statement was meant for the prelim to inflame the public in the court of public opinion. And not only to inflame the public, but also how many people are really going to back these guys now? You're going to see a lot of the people in the court of public opinion stay away from defending these guys. There'll be about 20% of the group that's doing it will still do so. But about 80% will be like, look, there's a lot of people I can defend in the court of public opinion. Why do I get to defend 2 or 3 guys who are clear racist, who had one of whom expressed the worst part really wasn't that statement in my view. It was from looking at it, from judging and assessing it, it was statements of racial violence that he had made long before then over the years to friends and other people. I was like, well, that suggests a certain mindset that when we don't have on video whether he approached Arbery, all we see them somehow hitting each other in the front center of the truck. We don't know whether he walked toward him because that would change things. For example, then Arbery's not just making a 90-degree turn, Arbery's reacting to him coming at him with the gun. So I think that now again, the whole case legally, this was explained by the defense lawyers making arguments at the prelim. Particularly the third guy, he made the strongest arguments at the prelim, I think in the crazy hope that maybe the judge would do something. The judge, by the way, looked like he was near dead. I don't know how old that guy is, but how he's still on the bench, I had no idea. But I was looking up there, I was like, man, I would not be inspired if that was my judge. I had a judge in Tennessee who kept sleeping on the bench, drove me nuts. But so there's no way that judge is going to grant a dismissal in a case like this. There was zero chance of it. That's why he's sleeping through. He's like, I already know what I'm going to do. I don't care what the evidence is. It's just a preliminary hearing in their mind. So and there's not a lot of people defending the McMichaels in the community. I mean, there's some, but not very loud. There's going to be a lot fewer now when they discovered that 2 of the 3 have. And to be honest, a lot of people are going to think if the son had that many racially hateful comments that he just said it casually on social media or with friends, what's the odds the father didn't have some of those same attitudes? That's going to implicate the police and the prosecutors. There's another reason why they may not have gone into the father's history. If he does have a history, do they want to expose that? Because that would be 18 years of criminal investigations and prosecutions that could be reopened tomorrow.
This is where people are going to scream, and rightly so, corruption as to potentially why the McMichaels were never charged in the first place, because this is the can of worms that an investigation and an indictment would have opened up.
Right.
Robert, this is going to be true in this case. It's going to be true in George Floyd. What do you say now? Like, what's the chances, or what is going to be done of spoiling or poisoning the jury pool? Like, how are these people going to get an impartial jury now that everybody in America knows, and they've probably formed a very radical opinion already?
Yeah, the utility of that, hypothetically, is that you get meaningful voir dire, you get meaningful jury selection when this occurs. You get to ask tons and tons of questions, because the hardest part of any criminal case or any civil case, to be honest, is not getting to know your jury. Now, here's what's not going to happen. They're not going to transfer the venue. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court made a ludicrous decision, in my view, in the Enron case. There you had 2/3 of the jury pool admitting they basically hated Enron, and yet somehow that made it okay for most of them to sit on the jury. And the Supreme Court said, that's all right. That isn't completely incurable. I mean, they just made it a joke. Everybody saw that, and they realized no judge in the country now is going to move a case. Because if the Supreme Court said you could try Enron in Houston, then by golly, there's nobody that's going to ever have more contamination than Enron did. Even this case is not going to have more contamination than Enron, because in the Enron case, they negatively impacted 2/3 of the community, directly or indirectly, in their behaviors, as well as scorched earth media coverage, books, documentaries, novels, films, you name it. So they're not going to be able to move the case. Now, I sometimes make that argument, and I did it in Snipes, and I do it solely for the purposes of trying to force the judge to give me jury selection, because I know he's not going to move it. But I want to force one of the solutions to the court say is, hey, you don't have to move it because you can do real detailed jury selection. And all I want in a case is jury selection. And to be honest, they're better off getting detailed jury selection in the local community than they are moving it to a random jury where they don't get jury selection. So in both Minnesota and the rest, I think they'll get detailed jury selection. The question is how honest people are. We saw in the Roger Stone case, they were not honest, in my view. Those jurors did not. They knew what the information people were trying to get at, and they played coy with their answers. And then the judge covered for them, because that's the nature of that case. So you still have risks like that. You have to scream a lot. To give you an example, in the Snipes case, despite the media coverage that had already occurred, when I first appeared in the case, which was 3 months prior to trial, the federal judge said, it's never taken me more than an hour to sit a jury and 30 years on the bench. I don't think this case is going to be any different. Well, when I was done, he ended up doing 3 days of jury selection. So but that required some, creative activities. There are ways. So I think if they're smart, they'll get good jury selection. And I think they both can get a fair jury if they do really good jury selection. But contrary to a lot of conventional wisdom, I think the Arbery case is a higher conviction rate than I believed before, based on the evidence. I mean, they found the smoking gun evidence they needed, evidence that at least 2 of the 3 people were motivated. But the people that were driving the vehicles and that had the gun that went off had long standing racial animus, demonstrated in a wide range of contexts.